They plan to kill her for insurance money. Sometimes the most shocking betrayals come from those we trust the most. Imagine the people you love, the ones you've cared for your whole life, plotting against you in ways you never could have imagined. Today's story is one of survival, of waking up to the truth, no matter how painful. Stay with me as we dive into the journey of one brave woman who faced betrayal head-on and lived to tell her story. The silent betrayal. It was late one evening when I first felt the weight of the silence press down on me in that house, my house, once filled with laughter and love. Now it was hollow like a shell washed up on the shore. The walls, once vibrant with memories, seemed to close in, and I found myself a stranger in the place I had built with my late husband, Charles. The first signs that something was wrong had been subtle, small, seemingly insignificant gestures at first. But over time, those small acts of neglect accumulated and the coldness became more palpable. My son, Robert, had been kind enough to invite me to live with him and his wife, Alicia, after Charles passed away. At the time, it seemed like a natural transition. I was aging and the house was too big for just one person. My grief was fresh and the quiet seemed unbearable. Moving in with Robert felt like a way to reconnect, to fill the void that had been left behind. But things were never the same once I stepped foot in their home. The first few days were pleasant enough, with Robert and Alicia making polite small talk, offering me help with daily chores. Yet there was always an underlying tension, an unspoken distance that grew as the days turned into weeks. I watched as Alicia, who I had once considered a daughter, began to treat me like an inconvenience. It started with her moving my things into boxes, labeling them for storage, as though my belongings, my memories, were just clutter. The piano that I had played every Sunday morning with such joy was pushed into the garage without a word. The recliner Charles had used to sit in every evening was gone, replaced by a chair that did not have the same warmth. Even my room, which had once been a sanctuary, was now a guest room at the back of the house, cold and drafty, with no view, just a reminder that I no longer had a place in their lives. At first, I told myself it was all part of the adjustment. Grief makes people act strange, doesn't it? Robert was busy, working long hours, and Alicia had her own way of dealing with my presence. I tried to be understanding, but the isolation began to seep in, and the realization started to grow that I was no longer welcome in my own family. I remember the day I first overheard the conversation. I had just returned from the kitchen with a cup of tea, a small gesture to show I was trying to be helpful, though it seemed as if my efforts were never enough. I stood just outside the bedroom door, the thin porcelain cup shaking slightly in my hands, not from the weight of the tea but from the words that reached my ears. "Why is she still here?" Alicia's voice was sharp, laced with contempt. "She's like a ghost, an old sofa no one can throw away." Robert's response was just as cold. "I don't know, but as long as she's breathing, we have to keep pretending. We can't collect the insurance if she's alive." The words hit me like a physical blow, though I remained rooted to the spot, unable to move. They didn't know I was standing there. They didn't know that I could hear every word, every callous plan. It wasn't just a slip of frustration, no, this was deliberate. This was cold calculation. I gripped the teacup tighter, trying to steady my shaking hands, and slowly backed away from the door. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around me as the full weight of their intentions settled in my chest. It wasn't just about neglect anymore, it was something darker. They were plotting my death. They had already taken out a life insurance policy on me, one that would pay them millions if I died. I had always thought that family was a safe place, a refuge where love and loyalty were unquestioned. But now I realized I was no longer just a mother or a grandmother to them. I was a liability, a burden they wanted to be rid of. The house that once held so many happy memories was now a cage. I wasn't wanted. I wasn't loved. I was just a means to an end. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in the bed that had once been mine, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with what I had overheard. How long had this been in the works? How long had they been planning to dispose of me, to collect the money and move on with their lives? The next few days passed in a haze. I went through the motions, eating the meals they set before me, doing the chores that had once been a part of my routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking around in a dream, unable to wake up. Robert, ever the dutiful son, continued to act like everything was normal, though I could see the guilt in his eyes whenever he looked at me. Alicia, on the other hand, became more and more distant, her polite smile never quite reaching her eyes. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, Robert surprised me with a gift, an SUV. A shiny, new, dark gray vehicle, its leather interior untouched, the smell of newness overwhelming. He handed me the keys, a grin on his face that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's for you, Ma," he said, "so you don't have to rely on us for rides anymore. Grocery store, church, whatever you like, no more burdening us." I was confused. Just a few weeks ago, Alicia had complained that I was too old to be trusted behind the wheel. Now, suddenly, they were giving me a car. Something didn't sit right, but I didn't question it. I accepted the keys, trying to play along, telling myself that maybe they were finally showing kindness. Maybe they felt guilty, maybe they had a change of heart, but I knew deep down that this wasn't a gift. This was part of their plan, a plan to make my death look like an accident. They wanted me gone, and this SUV was the vehicle that would carry me to my end, the unwanted guest. Days stretched into weeks, and I began to understand something more insidious was at play. As I adjusted to my new life under Robert and Alicia's roof, I slowly came to the painful realization that I had become nothing more than an unwanted guest in my own family. It was a chilling feeling to be ignored, disregarded, and shuffled aside in a home that I had once lovingly curated, a house that had been the backdrop to so many cherished memories of my late husband and me. The truth settled on me like a thick fog. The walls that had once echoed with the laughter of our children, the smell of fresh bread baking in the oven, and the sound of Charles's voice telling stories after dinner were now silent. The house felt too big, too empty, but it was not the kind of emptiness that comes from quiet, it was the emptiness that comes from abandonment. I remember the day Robert moved my things from the master bedroom to the guest room. He said it was for my own comfort, but the room he assigned me was cold and isolated, with no windows and a draft that bit into my bones every night. I never complained. I had learned long ago not to make waves. But I couldn't help feeling that something had changed within the walls of this house, something that made it no longer feel like home. I spent my days mostly alone. Alicia, ever distant, didn't invite me into conversations, didn't seek my help around the house, and avoided eye contact. Robert was hardly ever home, caught up in his busy work schedule, but when he was, he barely acknowledged my presence. There were no warm hugs, no moments of shared joy. Instead, there were polite nods and forced smiles that never reached the eyes. One of the most painful shifts was how I was excluded from family meals. Alicia would cook, but I noticed my plate would always be separate, covered with plastic wrap, placed at the far end of the table or sometimes in the kitchen. They ate in the dining room, a room that once felt like the heart of our home, a room where we had shared so many stories, so many laughs. Now it was just the two of them enjoying meals without me. My food was cold by the time I got to it. It was as though they were trying to make it clear I was not part of their world anymore. There were small indignities, too, that chipped away at my dignity. My favorite coffee mug, the one Charles had bought for me on our trip to the mountains, disappeared one day. When I asked Alicia about it, she said it was old and chipped, that I could just use the disposable mugs instead. I was stunned, but I didn't argue. I was being phased out, I realized. My belongings were no longer wanted, and neither was I. The bathroom that had once been shared between Robert and me was now Robert and Alicia only, boldly marked on a sign that had been placed in front of the door. The room where I had spent hours in front of the mirror, fixing my hair, getting ready for outings, was no longer mine. Instead, I was relegated to the tiny half-bath in the laundry room, a cramped, uncomfortable space that creaked and groaned whenever I opened the door. The smell of bleach and fabric softener clung to the air, and the floor was cold against my feet. The towel I used was no longer the soft, plush one that I had brought from my own room, but a thin, threadbare rag. The toiletries that had once lined the bathroom shelves were gone, replaced with nothing more than the essentials. The dog, Benny, who had been my companion for so many years, began to avoid me. He had always slept at my feet, curling up by my side at night. But Alicia didn't like dog hair, so Benny was no longer allowed in my room. He stopped greeting me at the door when I came home from errands. His absence was another reminder that I was no longer welcome. I didn't ask for much. I didn't demand attention, didn't ask for anything that wasn't already mine. All I wanted was to feel like I belonged, to feel like I was still part of the family. But with every passing day, the coldness grew, and I found myself retreating into my own world, hoping the silence would swallow me whole. I started to notice the subtle signs of their disdain. Alicia began treating me like an afterthought, as if my presence was a nuisance. She would make polite conversation but quickly change the subject when I tried to contribute. Robert, too, began to avoid looking me in the eye, and when he did speak to me, his words felt empty, distant, as though I was nothing more than a piece of furniture in the background of their lives. There was no warmth in his voice, no sense of connection, just cold duty. One afternoon, while I was cleaning the kitchen, I overheard a conversation between Robert and Alicia that made my blood run cold. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. I was simply walking through the hallway when I heard their voices rise in anger from behind a closed door. "Why can't she just go already?" Alicia's voice was dripping with disdain. "She's a burden and we can't keep pretending anymore. We need her gone." Robert's response was equally callous. I know, but we have to be careful. We don't want to get caught. The insurance policy needs her gone, but it has to look like an accident. She's just a shell now. No one will question it." I froze. I couldn't breathe. The room around me blurred, and for a moment I thought I would collapse. The words they spoke were so cruel, so deliberate, that they echoed in my mind long after the conversation ended. They had already made their plan. They had decided that I was no longer useful to them. My life had become a mere commodity, something they could discard once it no longer served their purpose. My heart raced as I realized the full extent of their plot. It wasn't just neglect anymore, it was something far darker. They had planned to kill me to make it look like an accident so they could collect the life insurance money. I was nothing more than a pawn to them, a way to get what they wanted. But I wasn't ready to die, not like this. Not at the hands of the people I had raised, loved, and trusted. I may have been old, but I wasn't weak. I had lived through hardship before, and I wasn't going to let them erase me so easily. I stood there in the hallway, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on me, but something inside me sparked. It was a flicker at first, small but undeniable. They thought I was old, frail, and easily dismissed, but I had something they didn't. I had time and I had a voice, and I was going to use both to fight back. The first signs of the plot. The weight of what I had overheard lingered in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating and unrelenting. I could no longer ignore it. Every interaction, every word, every glance between Robert and Alicia took on new meaning. Their once charming smiles now seemed false, their gestures of kindness nothing more than a performance. They were playing a part, pretending to care, pretending to be concerned, but behind the facade was something far darker. I could feel their eyes on me at all times, their scrutiny weighing down on me like a 1,000-pound stone. The house that once felt like a safe haven now felt like a trap. Every room was filled with reminders of the plans they had made, and no matter how hard I tried to push them out of my mind, they kept creeping back. It was as if they had already decided my fate. I began to pay closer attention to the little details, those moments that seemed insignificant at first but now made my heart race with unease. Robert's sudden gifts, like the shiny new SUV, had become more frequent, more exaggerated, as though he were trying to make up for something. The car wasn't just a vehicle, it was a tool, a carefully placed piece of the puzzle. The way he handed me the keys, the way Alicia opened the door for me, all felt rehearsed, as though they were playing a role in a play I didn't know I was part of. They were trying to convince me that I mattered, trying to make me feel like I was still loved, but I wasn't fooled. The truth was clear now, they wanted me gone. As days passed, they began to show even more subtle signs of their intentions. Alicia, who had been cold and distant from the start, began to act even more like a stranger. Her politeness now seemed forced, her smiles strained. I caught her glancing at me with an air of superiority, as though she were tolerating me rather than truly seeing me. And Robert, my own flesh and blood, became increasingly distant, his once warm eyes now cold and calculating. I could sense the change in him. The love that once flowed freely between us was now replaced with something darker, something calculated. One evening, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. As I sat in the living room, staring out the window at the trees swaying in the breeze, I overheard them talking again. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their voices were loud enough that I couldn't help but hear. They thought I was asleep, and I let them believe it. "It's almost time," Alicia said, her voice low and urgent. "She's practically walking around like a zombie already. I don't know how much longer we can keep pretending." "I know," Robert replied, his voice tight, "but we have to be patient. The insurance policy is almost finalized. Once it's all set up, we'll just wait for the right moment. The accident will look natural, it has to." Alicia's voice grew more desperate, more impatient. I don't want to wait anymore, Robert. I can't stand living with her. She's a constant reminder that we're stuck here taking care of her. And the sooner she's gone, the sooner we can move on. I want to be free. I want to go to Hawaii. I don't want to be dealing with her when the insurance check comes through. The words hit me like a slap to the face. They were planning to kill me. They weren't just neglecting me, they had planned everything with meticulous detail. Every action, every word was part of a plan to end my life and collect the money. My own son and his wife, the people I had trusted the most, were conspiring to kill me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the fear and disbelief flooding my body. I had always thought that family was supposed to be a place of safety and love, but now I realized that even those who were supposed to protect me were the very ones trying to harm me. The plan was clear now. They would make it look like an accident, a tragic mishap. They had already set the wheels in motion with the SUV. The ignition timer, the sleeping pills, the fake kindness, they had orchestrated it all. They were waiting for me to get into the car, to drive to the bridge, and then they would trigger the device. The car would explode and I would be gone, just another statistic. But they hadn't counted on one thing, me. I was not ready to die. Not like this, not at their hands. I had to act, and I had to act quickly. I couldn't let them get away with this. I had to find a way to protect myself, to turn the tables on them before it was too late. The thought of being murdered for money, for greed, was enough to fuel my determination. I wasn't going to be a victim. I wasn't going to let them destroy me. I began to think of a plan of my own, one that would expose their treachery and put an end to their scheme before it could succeed. I couldn't confront them directly, not yet. I knew I had to be careful, to gather evidence, to make sure I had everything I needed to ensure their downfall. I started by keeping a close eye on Robert and Alicia's movements. I paid attention to their conversations, listening for any slip-ups that could reveal more of their plan. I knew that the more information I had, the better my chances of turning the tide in my favor. They thought I was weak, that I was too old to fight back, but I had learned a long time ago that the true strength doesn't always come from physical power. Sometimes it comes from knowledge, from understanding the game that is being played, and from being able to outsmart your enemies. In the days that followed, I began to take small steps toward gathering evidence. I started writing down everything I could remember, every conversation, every detail, every moment that seemed suspicious. I kept track of the times they would leave the house, the moments when they were out of sight. I knew I had to be patient. I had to bide my time until I had enough to confront them, but I wasn't going to wait forever. I couldn't. My life was at stake. I could feel the walls closing in around me. I knew they were watching me, waiting for me to slip up. But I was determined not to give them that satisfaction. I would not be their victim. I would not be their pawn in a game of greed and deception. The first signs of their plot were just the beginning. I had heard their plan, and now it was time for me to write my own story. Theirs would end in failure. A sudden gift. The days after I overheard Robert and Alicia's conversation were the hardest. The house felt colder, every sound more oppressive. I became acutely aware of the tension in the air, the oppressive weight of their eyes on me. Even though they tried to act normal, it was impossible to ignore the underlying cruelty that had woven itself into the fabric of our interactions. I was no longer their mother, no longer part of the family. I was just a woman waiting to die, a tool for their greed. Then came the SUV. It was a bright Sunday afternoon when Robert came to me with that damn grin on his face, holding the keys to a shiny new car. He seemed too eager, too insistent. My stomach twisted when I saw the glint of triumph in his eyes. "I got you something, Ma," he said, a false cheer in his voice. "Come on, take a look, it's parked outside." I hesitated, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. It wasn't like Robert to be this generous. And Alicia, well, Alicia had never shown a shred of kindness since I moved in. I had already begun to suspect that something was terribly wrong, and now this, the sudden appearance of a brand new car, seemed too much, too perfect. It was like the final piece of a puzzle that had already been set in motion. I followed him out to the driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. There, parked like a gleaming monument to their deception, was the SUV. It was dark gray, shiny, and brand new. The leather seats were so pristine they almost seemed to glow. The dashboard was covered in protective film, the back seat adorned with a plush blanket that looked untouched. It was the kind of car that made a statement, the kind of car you give someone when you want them to feel important or cared for. But I knew better. I wasn't an idiot. I had seen through their lies long ago, and this was just another part of their plan. "You like it, Ma?" Robert's voice broke through my thoughts. He was standing beside me, holding out the keys with a triumphant grin. I looked at the keys, then at the car, and a chill ran down my spine. Why this car? You've barely spoken to me in months, and now you're giving me a car." "It's for you," he insisted, "so you can get around more easily, no more depending on us. Grocery store, church, wherever you need to go. We even added you to the insurance policy, made it official." Official. That word lingered in the air, heavy with implications I wasn't yet ready to confront, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. The pieces were falling into place, and they were fitting together far too neatly. I reached for the keys slowly, my fingers trembling. "You added me to the insurance policy." Robert nodded eagerly. "Of course, everything's taken care of. It's all official now, no more worrying about rides or errands. We thought this would be easier for you, no more hassles." I wanted to ask more, to question him, to demand the truth, but I couldn't. The truth was already obvious, and confronting him would give him the satisfaction of seeing my fear. Instead, I smiled, taking the keys from his outstretched hand. "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely a whisper, but inside my mind was racing. I could feel the coldness in my bones, the icy realization that this gift was anything but. It was a trap, a carefully designed piece of their plot to make it look like an accident. They were setting me up, and I had no choice but to play along. Alicia stood at the front door, arms crossed, a tight smile plastered on her face. Her eyes, however, were cold. She wasn't happy about this gesture. She was calculating, watching, waiting for the moment when I would step into the car, ready to meet my end. The whole thing felt like a stage, with me as the unwilling actor in a play I didn't know I had auditioned for. The lights were on me, the script was written, and the scene was set. But they hadn't counted on one thing. I wasn't going to follow their script. I tried to push the unease aside as I climbed into the SUV, but the moment I sat in the plush leather seat, I felt like I was sinking into a coffin. The car smelled like new leather, a fragrance that was supposed to comfort me, but instead it only reminded me of what was to come. I ran my fingers over the seatbelt, and I could almost feel Alicia's eyes on me, watching for every movement, every click of the buckle, as if she were waiting for something specific to happen. Robert was in the driver's seat, his smile still in place, his eyes fixed ahead as he started the engine. The car roared to life with a smooth hum, and I was struck by how easy it would be for me to slip into the routine they had planned. How easy it would be to drive off, to be lulled into a sense of normalcy, to forget what I knew. But I couldn't. I had to stay alert. I had to stay alive. We drove for a while, and the scenery passed by like a blur. The streets, the trees, the houses, they all seemed the same, but in my mind I was racing ahead. I knew this was their moment. The ignition timer, the device in the car, it was all set to activate. I could feel it in the air, in the way Robert glanced at me too often, the way Alicia stayed quiet, her face locked in a mask of feigned concern. They thought I was clueless. They thought I was just an old woman, easily deceived, easily manipulated. But I had seen the way they looked at me, heard their plans, and I knew that I couldn't trust them. Not anymore. The drive felt endless, but I wasn't going to let myself be taken, not without a fight. As we reached the edge of town, I looked out the window, noticing the bridge up ahead, the one they had talked about. It was quiet, isolated, just the kind of place where an accident could easily happen. I knew they expected me to get out of the car and drive off just like they had planned, but I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. I kept my eyes on the road, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't let my guard down. I had to survive. And then, just as we neared the bridge, something unexpected happened. Robert slowed down, a subtle shift in his demeanor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me freeze. The timer, it was close, too close. I was ready. I wasn't going to die today. The hidden agenda. The closer we got to the bridge, the more the air seemed to thicken around me. The hum of the engine, the creak of the suspension, even the quiet murmur of the tires against the asphalt, all of it felt like a countdown. The bridge loomed in the distance, its outline growing sharper with each passing second. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. This was it. This was the moment they had planned for. I glanced over at Robert. He was staring straight ahead, his grip tight on the steering wheel. He had turned into a stranger over the last few months, his once familiar face now a mask of cold calculation. The son I had raised, the boy who used to curl up in my lap when he was little, was gone. In his place was a man I barely recognized, one who had sold out every ounce of love and loyalty for a shot at a fortune. Beside me, Alicia was eerily quiet. Her usual sarcasm, her biting remarks, everything that made her the woman I once tolerated was gone. She sat still, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, pretending to be absorbed in something that wasn't really there. But I saw her hand resting on the armrest, fingers twitching slightly as if she were anticipating something. I knew then that they thought this was the end of the road for me, literally and figuratively. Alicia was watching me, and I could feel her gaze like a physical weight on my skin. She was waiting for me to make a mistake, for me to slip up and do something foolish. I could see it in her eyes, the excitement, the expectation. She thought I was a helpless old woman lost in the fog of age, unable to fight back. She had no idea who she was dealing with. I could feel my pulse racing as we approached the bridge. It stretched across the water like a line drawn between life and death, a boundary that I was unwilling to cross. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the river, and I could almost hear their plan unraveling in my head. They wanted me to drive into that bridge, to lose control, to be swallowed by the flames that would ignite when the ignition timer activated. They thought it was foolproof, but they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know how much time I had spent learning every corner of their plan. I focused on my breathing, taking slow, steady breaths to calm my racing thoughts. I couldn't let my fear consume me. I had to think clearly to stay sharp. My life depended on it. As we neared the bridge, I could feel my body tense. This was the moment. It felt like everything in the car, the silence, the stillness, was waiting for something. Robert didn't glance at me once. Alicia's hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes darting between me and the road. They were both waiting for me to make a move. They thought they had me cornered. They thought this was the end of my story, but it was. I kept my hand on the seatbelt, my fingers lightly brushing against the buckle. If I could make it to the bridge, I could make it to safety. But first, I had to get out of this car. As if on cue, Robert eased off the gas pedal, his hands relaxed on the wheel. The car slowed, the engine humming with the shift in speed. I glanced at the rearview mirror. We were almost there. The bridge was just ahead. My pulse quickened, and I knew that it was time to act. A flicker of movement caught my eye as I reached for the seatbelt. Alicia's fingers had moved too, and for a split second I saw the glint of something metallic in her hand. It was a small device, sleek, inconspicuous, but I recognized it instantly. It was the ignition timer, the device they had planned to use to trigger the explosion. My heart skipped a beat as I realized just how close I was to death. I had to act. I had to move faster than they expected. In that moment, everything seemed to happen at once. My fingers were already gripping the seatbelt, and without thinking, I pulled it off. I swung my legs to the side, preparing to make a move. I couldn't stay in the passenger seat any longer. I had to get out. Alicia saw me move. Her eyes widened, but it was too late. I had already thrown open the door and was halfway out of the car before she could react. Robert slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. My momentum was already carrying me out of the car, my feet hitting the gravel of the shoulder. The SUV screeched to a halt just as I tumbled onto the side of the road, the door flinging wide open in my wake. For a moment, I just lay there on the ground, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of my breath ragged and uneven. I didn't move. I couldn't. I was still too stunned to process what had just happened. But I knew one thing. I had to get up. I had to run. The SUV was still parked on the edge of the road, but the danger was far from over. I could see Alicia's face in the rearview mirror, her expression twisted in fury, her eyes flashing with anger and disbelief. Robert was still sitting in the driver's seat, frozen, his hands gripping the wheel like he was afraid to move. I didn't have time to wait for them to figure out what had happened. I scrambled to my feet, pain shooting up my legs, but I didn't stop. I ran. I ran as fast as I could, my legs shaking beneath me, the sound of my footsteps barely audible over the roar of the wind in my ears. It wasn't until I reached the far side of the bridge that I dared to look back. The SUV was still there, parked at the edge, but the car's engine was silent. It was no longer a threat. I had gotten away. For the first time in what felt like months, I breathed a sigh of relief. The plan to kill me had been thwarted. I wasn't dead yet. And now I had to make sure they paid for what they had tried to do. I was shaken, yes, but I was alive. And that was the only thing that mattered. The suspicious pills. The days following my escape from the SUV were a blur. I kept moving, my mind racing to process everything that had happened. I had narrowly escaped their plot, but I knew that the danger wasn't over. Robert and Alicia would be back, perhaps not immediately, but they wouldn't give up. I had to prepare myself for whatever came next. I spent the next few nights in a small, inconspicuous motel on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it was safe. The owner didn't ask questions, and that was all I needed. I didn't know who to trust anymore, but I knew one thing: I had to keep my wits about me. I couldn't let my guard down. The worst part was knowing that the people I had once loved, the people I had trusted the most, were the ones who wanted to kill me. It was a betrayal I couldn't easily shake. But as the days went by, something else began to gnaw at me, a growing suspicion that there was more to their plan than just the car and the insurance policy. I had already seen the lengths they were willing to go to. They had planned my death with a precision that was chilling, but there was something else. Something subtle, something I hadn't noticed until after I fled the SUV. It was the sleeping pills. When Robert and Alicia had given me the pills just days before I ran from the car, something had seemed off. They had insisted that I take them for my own good, that I needed rest, that the stress was too much for me to handle. I had thought it was a small kindness at the time, something that showed they were at least trying to take care of me, but now I realized just how dangerous those pills were. I hadn't given them much thought at first. They were just ordinary pills, after all, nothing unusual about them. But now, in the safety of my motel room, I looked at the bottle again. The label had my name on it, and it was clearly a prescription, but there was something off about it. The pharmacy name seemed unfamiliar, and when I looked closer, I saw that the contact number on the label led to a place far out of town, a small, unlisted drugstore I had never heard of. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach as I turned the bottle over in my hands. The pills themselves were light blue, a color I hadn't seen in any of the prescriptions I'd taken in the past. They looked almost too perfect, too uniform. The shape, the color, they didn't match anything I had ever used before. And yet, Alicia had insisted they were prescribed by a doctor, that they were just a mild sedative to help me sleep. But something told me that they weren't what they seemed. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that these pills weren't for my benefit. They were part of their plan. I took a deep breath and forced myself to focus. I couldn't afford to panic. I had to stay calm and think things through. I needed answers. But where could I find them? I couldn't trust anyone I knew, not now. Robert and Alicia had already proven that. If I was going to find out the truth about the pills, I would have to do it on my own. The first thing I did was call the pharmacy. I used a burner phone that I had picked up at a local convenience store, another precaution to ensure I wasn't being traced. The phone rang twice before a voice on the other end answered. "Good afternoon, how can I help you?" "Hi, I'm calling about a prescription I filled there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's for Geneva Collier. I just wanted to confirm the details." There was a slight pause on the other end before the voice responded. "Let me look that up for you." The click of the keyboard echoed through the line. I waited, holding my breath. This was it. I needed to know if the prescription was legitimate, if I could trust what they had given me. "I'm sorry," the pharmacist said after a moment. "I don't see any prescription under that name in our records." I froze. My heart skipped a beat. No prescription. I had the bottle in my hand. I knew the pills had come from somewhere. Alicia had given them to me with a smile, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. But now it was becoming clear that something was terribly wrong. "You're sure?" I pressed. It was filled recently. The label is from your pharmacy." The voice on the other end hesitated. "Let me double-check," the pharmacist said. I could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background. After what felt like an eternity, the voice returned more hesitantly this time. "I'm sorry, but I can't find any record of that prescription being filled here. I suggest you contact the doctor who prescribed it for you." My mind raced as I processed what I had just learned. The pills weren't prescribed by a doctor, they had been forged. Alicia had gone to great lengths to make it look like a legitimate prescription, to make it seem as though they were simply trying to help me. But they weren't trying to help me at all, they were trying to drug me, to lull me into a false sense of security so they could finish their plan. I hung up the phone, my hands shaking. I had been right. The pills were a key part of their plot. They had been trying to sedate me to make me too weak to resist when the time came, and I had been so close to taking them. I knew now that I couldn't trust anything they had given me. The pills, the car, the so-called kindness, it was all part of a carefully constructed lie. I was being manipulated, and they had been setting me up for my final act, a final bow in their twisted play. But I wasn't going to let them win. I had already escaped once, and I wasn't going to stop now. I had to get out of town, get away from them, and make sure that they paid for what they had done. The truth was out there, and I was going to find it. I stood up, my resolve hardening. It was time to fight back. The chilling discovery. The following morning, I didn't sleep a wink. The dark, suffocating thoughts of what had transpired weighed heavily on me as I sat at the small, dimly lit motel desk. My hands trembled as I tried to gather my thoughts, but my mind kept returning to the pills. The moment I realized they weren't legitimate, that they were part of the conspiracy, everything else began to fall into place. The SUV, the staged kindness, and now the sleeping pills. It was all part of a plan to incapacitate me, to lull me into submission before the final act. I couldn't shake the image of Robert and Alicia's faces when they realized I had figured it out. They had underestimated me, thinking I was too frail, too old to notice their deception, but I was sharper than they thought. I had lived through much more than they would ever understand. I wasn't going to be their victim, not after everything I had survived in life. I knew the next step had to be critical. I had to find more evidence, something undeniable, something that would ensure they could never get away with what they were planning. I had already exposed the sleeping pills for what they were, but there had to be more. They had to have left behind something, anything that would tie them to the plot. I looked at the pile of papers I had collected over the past few days. Receipts, notes, the bottle of pills, each one a clue, a small piece of the puzzle. But they weren't enough. I needed the smoking gun. I needed something that would expose their cruelty once and for all. Then it hit me. I remembered the folder. The one I had seen in Alicia's bedroom, wedged between old magazines and scarves. I had been so focused on the pills and the SUV that I hadn't fully processed what I had seen in that folder. But now, as I sat in the dim light of my motel room, the memory of it crept back into my mind. The folder was thick, and when I saw it in Alicia's vanity, it seemed out of place. It had been hidden, tucked away as if it was something to be kept secret. The moment I'd touched it, I'd known it was important, too important to leave behind. I had taken it with me, but I hadn't opened it until now. In the quiet solitude of my room, I knew it was time to look deeper, to see what they had written in their own words. I reached for the folder, my fingers brushing against the rough texture of the paper. My heart pounded as I carefully opened it, not sure what I would find inside, but what I saw made my stomach turn. The first sheet was a simple document, my name at the top, my birth date, my social security number, and an address I hadn't seen in years. At first glance, it seemed like an ordinary piece of paperwork, but as I continued to read, my breath caught in my throat. It was an insurance policy, a life insurance policy taken out in my name. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I had been living in a false sense of security, thinking that my family cared for me, that they had my best interests at heart. But this was a betrayal of the highest order. They had forged my signature. They had bought a life insurance policy for $5 million that would go straight into their pockets when I was gone. The room seemed to spin as I flipped through the pages. There were emails between Alicia and an insurance agent where she referred to me as the aging dependent and asked about clauses that would ensure my death was considered accidental. She even inquired about expedited processing, citing my declining health. I felt nauseous as I realized just how deeply this went. It wasn't just about money. It was about control, about orchestrating my death in such a way that no one would question it. They had planned every detail with cold precision, as though my life meant nothing to them. The policy itself was listed under my name, but it was clear that the signature wasn't mine. It was a forgery, a close one, but I knew my own handwriting better than anyone. It wasn't mine. They had carefully studied it, traced it, and created a perfect replica, but it was fake, and I now had the proof. The documents included a receipt for the device they had purchased, the one that would trigger the explosion in the SUV. The receipt showed that it was delivered to their home, addressed to Alicia. The device, a custom ignition timer, was wired to trigger combustion through an app. It was all so clinical, so meticulously planned. The timer had been set to activate just as I reached the bridge, just as they had discussed. The insurance policy, the SUV, the pills, they had orchestrated it all. I couldn't breathe. The weight of what I was holding in my hands felt like 100 pounds. But in that moment, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't let them get away with it. I couldn't let them erase me from this world just to satisfy their greed. I had to fight back, and I had the evidence to prove it. I took out my phone and called the one person I knew I could trust, Evelyn. She had been my friend for decades, someone I could always rely on. She had been there for me during the hardest times in my life, and now I needed her more than ever. "Evelyn," I said when she picked up. My voice shook, but I managed to keep my tone steady. "I have everything. I have the proof. They've been planning to kill me. I need your help." There was a brief silence on the other end, and then her voice came through, calm and steady as always. "I'm coming to you. Stay where you are. Don't let them know you found out. We're going to take them down." I hung up the phone and sat back in the chair, my heart still racing. I had what I needed. The evidence, the proof of their treachery was in my hands. It was time to make sure that Robert and Alicia paid for what they had done. I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The hidden evidence. The room felt smaller, the air thicker as I sat there with the folder in my lap. My hands were shaking, not from fear but from the adrenaline surging through my veins. I had just uncovered the darkest secret of my life, the extent of my own family's betrayal. They had planned to kill me, not with some vague hint of neglect or a quiet, unnoticed slip into the shadows of old age, but with precision, premeditation, and a chilling lack of remorse. and they had thought I wouldn't notice. Now I had everything I needed to expose them. I had the life insurance policy, the forged signature, the emails detailing the murder plot, and the receipt for the device that would have taken my life in a fiery accident. I had the proof. But having proof was only half the battle. I needed to make sure that it would be enough. I needed to make sure that Robert and Alicia would be held accountable for what they had done and what they had tried to do. I felt the weight of the folder pressing down on me, but the surge of purpose that followed was far heavier. I wasn't a victim anymore. I wasn't helpless. I had been awake to their lies and manipulation all along, and now I had the power to stop them. I didn't waste any time. I knew I had to act quickly. They wouldn't wait forever, and every second I spent deliberating was a second they could use to cover their tracks. I had to get this evidence to the right people, but who could I trust? Who would believe me when it came to a matter as serious as this? How could I be sure the authorities would take me seriously given the circumstances? I knew one person I could count on, Evelyn. She had always been there for me when I was young, when I lost Charles, and now in this darkest moment of my life. I trusted her with everything, and I knew that if anyone could help me navigate this nightmare, it was her. I called her immediately. "Evelyn, it's worse than I thought," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I have everything, proof of what they've done, of what they plan to do. I need you to help me. I can't do this alone." Evelyn didn't hesitate. "I'm on my way, Jenny. I'll be there as soon as I can. Just keep your head down. Don't let them know you figured it out." The call ended, but I didn't feel any better. I still had a million questions running through my mind. What was my next move? How could I make sure they couldn't slip through the cracks of the system? And what if they came for me again before I could get help? As I waited for Evelyn to arrive, I sat in silence, staring at the folder. The evidence was undeniable, but it was still just paper and ink. I needed more. I needed to make sure Robert and Alicia wouldn't be able to weasel their way out of this. I thought back to their conversation, the one I had overheard when they believed I was asleep. They had been so sure of themselves, so confident that their plan would succeed. But now, as the truth had unraveled, their carefully constructed web was beginning to fall apart. It was then that I realized what I needed to do. I had to find a way to confront them, calmly, quietly, before they realized I knew what they had been planning. I needed to make sure they couldn't just brush this under the rug, to make sure they couldn't play the victim when everything came out. I waited, the minutes stretching endlessly, until I heard the faint sound of a car pulling into the parking lot outside my room. My heart skipped a beat. It was Evelyn. I rushed to the door and opened it, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume, that mix of peppermint and lavender that always reminded me of childhood. She stepped inside without a word, her sharp, calculating eyes scanning the room. She was every bit the lawyer I remembered, the one who had held my hand through the darkest days of my past. And now she was here to help me in the darkest moment of my life. Without wasting time, I handed her the folder. She took it from me, flipping through the pages with practiced ease. Her eyes narrowed as she read each line, absorbing the damning evidence in front of her. "I knew it," she said softly, more to herself than to me. "I knew something wasn't right, but this is something else." I watched as she continued to go through the documents. The shock was evident in her face, but there was no panic, no fear, just the quiet determination that had always defined her. She was already thinking ahead, already formulating a plan. "I'll take this straight to the authorities," she said after a moment. "But I want to be sure we have everything we need, more than just the paper trail. We need their voices, their admissions." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. We needed them to slip up. We needed to make sure they couldn't deny their intentions once the truth was laid bare. Evelyn's plan was simple but effective. We would gather everything we could: recordings, photographs, any additional evidence that could tie them directly to the plot. But the key to our success was timing. We had to move quickly before Robert and Alicia had a chance to cover their tracks, before they had a chance to make things disappear. The next few days would be critical. "I'm going to get in touch with a few people I trust," Evelyn said. "We'll need to set up some surveillance. We'll need to catch them in the act, get their confessions on record." I nodded again, but this time I felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time since I overheard their conversation, I felt like I was no longer a helpless victim. I had the evidence, I had the plan, and with Evelyn by my side, I knew we could take them down. We spent the next several hours making phone calls, organizing our strategy. I couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose, a clarity that had been missing for so long. Robert and Alicia thought they had won, that their plan was foolproof, but they had underestimated me, and they had underestimated Evelyn. And now it was time for their game to come to an end. The next few days would be crucial, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I was ready. I had survived their plot, and I wasn't going to stop until I made sure they paid for what they had done. Turning the tables. The hours dragged on after Evelyn's visit. I knew that I couldn't afford to wait too long. Every second counted, and every moment I spent in this small motel room, isolated from the world, was a reminder of how much danger I was still in. I wasn't just hiding from Robert and Alicia, I was waiting for the right moment to expose them, to ensure they would never get away with what they had planned. Evelyn had promised me that she would take care of everything. She had a network of people, lawyers, investigators, and even a few trusted contacts in law enforcement who could help, but I couldn't sit idly by while they worked. I had been too passive for too long, and I wasn't about to let Robert and Alicia win. They had already stolen enough from me: my peace, my safety, my trust. Now they would steal nothing more. I spent the next few days preparing. Evelyn had left me with some basic instructions: stay low, stay quiet, and wait for her to reach out when the time was right. But the waiting was the hardest part. Every time a car drove by, I tensed. Every knock on the door made my heart race. I could feel Robert and Alicia closing in, even though I knew they had no idea where I was. They would be looking for me. They would try to find me to finish what they had started. But I wouldn't let them, not now, not ever. The phone rang late one afternoon. I had been pacing the room, my nerves stretched thin. I grabbed the phone before it could ring again, my heart pounding in my chest. It was Evelyn. "I've got good news." Her voice was steady, calm, exactly what I needed to hear. "We're ready. I've set up surveillance, and we've got a plan to catch them red-handed. It's time to turn the tables." Relief flooded through me. After all the fear and uncertainty, after all the months of living in dread, this was the moment I had been waiting for. I wasn't just running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I was about to take control. Evelyn went on to explain the details of the plan. She had already contacted a private investigator who had been following Robert and Alicia's movements. They had gathered enough footage to corroborate their actions and prove that they had been actively conspiring to kill me. The investigator had caught them making phone calls to the insurance company discussing the fake accident and even working with the supplier who had provided the ignition device. It was all on tape. But the most important piece of evidence was still missing. We needed them to admit their guilt. We needed them to say the words on record so there would be no way for them to deny their intentions. And that's where Evelyn's plan came in. "Tomorrow we're going to set up a meeting," Evelyn said. "We'll make sure they're alone and we'll use the recordings. We have to corner them. Once they realize they've been caught, they'll crack. They always do." I felt a surge of hope rising within me. Tomorrow it would all be over. Robert and Alicia would finally be held accountable for what they had done. No more games, no more lies, just justice. The next morning, I packed what little I had left in the motel room. It was a strange feeling knowing I was leaving behind a life I had once known so well. But that life was gone now. It had been replaced with fear, deception, and betrayal. The woman who had once felt secure in her own home, surrounded by family, was now someone entirely different. I had been forced to evolve, to become someone who could stand up for herself, who could fight back. And I wasn't going to let that woman fade away. I drove to the meeting spot Evelyn had arranged, a small cafe on the outskirts of town. It was quiet, unassuming, and perfect for what we needed. No one would expect anything out of the ordinary to happen here, but I knew that this would be the place where everything changed. As I sat in the cafe waiting for Evelyn to arrive, I felt a strange calm wash over me. The plan was in motion. There was no going back now. The next few hours would determine everything. I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting for my dignity, for my right to be seen as a person, not a pawn. Evelyn arrived shortly after, her presence a steadying force. She was carrying a small bag with the recorder inside, along with all the evidence we had gathered. We exchanged a brief look before sitting down, our eyes locking for just a second, an unspoken understanding between us. We were in this together and we were going to win. "We'll need to be quick," Evelyn said, glancing at her watch. "We don't want them to get too comfortable. We have to catch them off guard." I nodded, the anticipation building in my chest. I had spent so many years being passive, being ignored and dismissed. Now I was in control. The tables had turned and it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. A few minutes later, Robert and Alicia walked into the cafe. Robert was wearing his usual smug expression, the one that always made me feel like I was beneath him. Alicia's face was tighter than usual, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She was always calculating, always looking for the next opportunity to manipulate or control the situation. But today, she wouldn't be the one in control. They sat down at the table and I could feel the tension in the air. Evelyn wasted no time. She opened the folder, placing the evidence on the table in front of them. The look of shock that crossed Robert's face was almost laughable. "What is this?" Alicia asked, her voice trembling slightly as she glanced at the documents. Evelyn leaned forward. "This is the end of your little game. We know what you've been planning and we have everything we need to prove it. The insurance policy, the forged signatures, the device you plan to use to kill her, it's all here." Robert's eyes widened and for the first time I saw fear in his gaze. He tried to speak, but his words faltered. Alicia's face drained of color as the reality of the situation hit her. "You thought you could get away with this," Evelyn continued, her voice calm but firm. But you underestimated her, and now it's time for you to face the consequences. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the truth hanging in the air, and in that silence I knew this was it. Robert and Alicia had been caught. There was no turning back for them now. The plan had worked, and with that my fight was over. The final act. The silence in the cafe stretched on, thick and suffocating. Robert and Alicia sat there, their faces pale and tense, as they tried to comprehend the magnitude of what had just been revealed. It was as if the ground beneath them had shifted, the comfortable lies they had been living with suddenly falling apart beneath the weight of the truth. I could see it in their eyes: desperation, disbelief, and, above all, fear. They hadn't expected to be exposed. They thought they were too clever, too untouchable. But here I was, sitting across from them, holding all the evidence, holding their future in my hands. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of power, a sense of clarity. All the uncertainty, all the doubt seemed to vanish in an instant. This was my moment, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. They had thought they could erase me, discard me, make me vanish like I was nothing. But I wasn't just a victim, I was a survivor. Evelyn's calm voice cut through the tension in the room. "You've been planning this for months, haven't you?" she asked, her eyes never leaving theirs. "The insurance policy, the car, the pills, all of it. You were so sure of yourselves, you thought she wouldn't see it coming. But you underestimated her. You underestimated what she's capable of." Alicia's lips trembled and she opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face flushed, his hands twitching as if he were about to grab for something, anything to defend himself. But he was trapped, and we both knew it. "You should have been more careful," Evelyn continued, her voice cold, matter of fact. "You left a trail, and now you're going to pay for it." Robert's voice finally broke the silence. "This isn't what it looks like," he said quickly, his voice rising in panic. "We never meant for it to go this far. It was just a mistake, a joke. We didn't actually." "A joke?" I interrupted, my voice steady despite the fury that simmered beneath the surface. "A joke? You planned my death for money. You wanted me gone just so you could collect a check. Don't insult me with your excuses, Robert. I'm not that stupid." Alicia finally found her voice, but it was barely a whisper. "Please," she begged, her eyes flicking nervously to the door. "We didn't mean for this to happen. We needed the money. We were under pressure." "You don't understand." I couldn't hold back any longer. "No, Alicia, you don't understand. You don't understand what it's like to love someone, to have them trust you, only to find out that they've been planning to kill you for money. You don't understand what it feels like to have your own flesh and blood betray you." Evelyn reached into her bag and pulled out the recorder she had brought with her. "This," she said, placing it on the table between us, "is what's going to seal your fate. We've been recording every conversation, every slip-up. We have it all, your confession, the emails, the receipts, the proof that you were plotting murder." Robert's face turned even paler, if that was possible. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape that wasn't there. But there was no escape. No amount of pleading, no amount of excuses would get him out of this. He had made his choice when he had decided to betray me, and now he was going to pay the price. "Please," Alicia whimpered, her voice cracking as tears began to form in her eyes. "I didn't want this. I didn't want any of it. I was just trying to make things easier. I didn't think it would go this far." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I felt a deep, cold emptiness inside. There was no sorrow, no regret in her eyes. There was only fear, fear of being caught, fear of the consequences, but there was no empathy. No remorse for what they had done. She wasn't sorry for trying to kill me. She was sorry she had been caught. No, I said quietly, shaking my head. You didn't want to make things easier. You wanted to take the easy way out. You wanted to get rid of me so you could live your life without any responsibility. You didn't want to care for me. You didn't want to love me. You wanted to erase me, but I won't let you. I won't let you win. There was a long pause, and in that moment I realized that this wasn't just about them anymore. It wasn't just about the betrayal, the manipulation, the lies. It was about reclaiming my own life, my own voice. It was about standing up for myself even when the world seemed to turn against me. And it was about justice, because justice wasn't something they could take away, not today, not ever. Evelyn stood up, her movements deliberate and calm. I've already contacted the authorities. The evidence we have is irrefutable, and I've already made sure that everything is in order. You'll both be arrested, charged, and convicted. Your plan is over. I could see the realization hit them, crashing into them like a wave. The certainty that they would get away with it was gone. The facade of control they had built over the last few months was shattered. They were no longer the ones calling the shots. They were the ones being held accountable. I stood up, my body still trembling slightly, but my resolve stronger than ever. You don't get to make the rules anymore, I said, my voice unwavering. You don't get to decide who lives and who dies. I survived, and now you'll face the consequences of your actions. Robert tried one last time to salvage something, anything. Please, we're sorry, we didn't mean it, we. Enough, I interrupted, my voice firm. There is no excuse for what you did. There is no going back. The door to the cafe opened then, and two plainclothes officers walked in. They didn't need any introduction. They knew exactly who they were there for. Without a word, they approached Robert and Alicia, their faces stern, their hands ready to restrain. Robert Collier, Alicia Collier, one of the officers said, his voice cold. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and attempted manslaughter. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law. As the officers handcuffed them, I felt a strange sense of closure. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It wasn't vengeance. It was something deeper, something more profound, justice. The truth had come out and the scales had balanced. They were led out of the cafe, their heads bowed in defeat, and I remained standing, my heart still racing but my mind clear. I had done it. I had survived. I turned to Evelyn, who was watching me with a quiet pride in her eyes. It's over, I whispered. She nodded. Yes, it is. You did well, Jenny. You did exactly what you needed to do. As I left the cafe, stepping into the bright afternoon sun, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The battle had been long, but it was finally over, and now I was free. The investigation. The days following Robert and Alicia's arrest passed in a blur, like I was living outside my own body, watching the pieces of my life fall into place from a distance. The weight of their betrayal had been crushing, but now that they were behind bars, I felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe without fear tightening around my chest. The nightmare was over. Or so I thought. Evelyn had been by my side throughout the entire ordeal. She was a force of nature, helping me navigate the complex legal landscape, offering guidance and making sure that nothing slipped through the cracks. We were meticulous in the way we approached the situation. With Robert and Alicia in custody, the investigation was in full swing. The evidence we had gathered, the forged signatures, the life insurance policy, the emails, and the recordings, was irrefutable. The authorities had all the pieces they needed. But there was something about the investigation that felt uneasy, like an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. The more I learned, the more I realized that Robert and Alicia weren't the only ones with something to hide. As the authorities sifted through their lives, uncovering layers of deceit, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were deeper roots to the story, roots I hadn't seen, but that might still be out there, lurking in the shadows. It was early one morning when I received the call. Evelyn's voice on the other end was calm, but there was an edge to it that made me sit up straight in bed. "They're going to charge them with more than we expected," she said, her words cutting through the quiet of the room. "The authorities have found connections. Robert and Alicia didn't act alone. There's something bigger going on." I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. "They've found something?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "What do you mean?" "Robert and Alicia's names are just the tip of the iceberg," Evelyn continued. "The investigators found that they've been laundering money through fake companies, and it doesn't stop there. It looks like they've been involved in a number of shady dealings over the years, people who owe them money, illegal transactions. They've been playing both sides of the law for years." I swallowed hard, trying to process what she was saying. It made sense in a twisted way. Robert had always been good at hiding things, slipping under the radar, making sure no one knew exactly what he was up to. But to think that he and Alicia had been part of something so deep, something so dangerous, it made me sick. "What does this mean?" I asked, my mind racing. "It means that we need to be careful," Evelyn replied, her voice firm. "The investigation is only just beginning, and now it's not just about the insurance fraud. It's about everything else they've done. It's bigger than we thought, Jenny. They have connections, dangerous ones, and if they start talking, it could lead us into even more dangerous territory." The weight of her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and ominous. My mind was spinning. I had thought that Robert and Alicia were the source of all my problems. I had thought that once they were caught, once they were behind bars, I would finally be free. But now it seemed like that was just the beginning of a much larger web I hadn't even known existed. Over the next few days, the investigation grew more intense. Law enforcement agencies from multiple jurisdictions began to converge on the case. Robert and Alicia's past was being picked apart piece by piece. The money laundering was just the tip of the iceberg, and as the investigation deepened, more of their illegal dealings were exposed. It turned out that the life insurance scheme wasn't the only thing they'd been orchestrating. They had been involved in a series of financial schemes, money laundering, blackmail, even illegal gambling rings. It was unsettling to think that I had been living under the same roof as two people so entrenched in crime. The shock was overwhelming, but what troubled me even more was the realization that they weren't acting alone. They had connections, people who had helped them cover their tracks, people who had been complicit in their schemes. One evening, as Evelyn and I sat together at a local diner going over the latest reports from the investigation, she shared something that made my blood run cold. The authorities believe that someone in their network might have been the one who tipped them off about the investigation, Evelyn said, her voice low. They think someone is still out there, someone who was feeding Robert and Alicia information, making sure they stayed one step ahead. I leaned forward, my mind racing. Do they have any idea who it is? Not yet, Evelyn replied, but they're looking into everyone who had contact with Robert and Alicia over the years. Anyone who might have helped them hide their tracks. It's only a matter of time before they find the person responsible, but we can't ignore the fact that whoever this person is, they're dangerous. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. This wasn't just about Robert and Alicia anymore. There was someone else out there, a shadow, a ghost in the background, pulling strings, orchestrating events from the shadows, and that person might be closer than I realized. Over the next week, Evelyn and I continued to stay in touch, keeping a low profile as the investigation continued to unfold. I tried to keep my distance from the media, knowing that once the story broke, there would be no escaping the attention. But I couldn't help but feel a gnawing unease. What if this wasn't over? What if the danger wasn't just in the past but still looming over me? Then one afternoon I received an unexpected visit. It was an agent from the local police department, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair and a no-nonsense attitude. She introduced herself as Detective Harris. "I've been assigned to your case, Mrs. Collier," she said, shaking my hand. "I'm afraid we need to ask you some questions." The questions came fast, and I could see the weight of the investigation in her eyes. She was serious, methodical. Every question she asked was another piece of the puzzle. But what struck me most was the question she asked last. "Do you have any idea who might have been involved in this besides Robert and Alicia?" She asked, her tone measured. I swallowed hard. It wasn't just the family that had been involved. There was someone else, someone who was still out there, hiding in the shadows, and that thought terrified me more than anything else. The investigation was far from over, and the real danger was just beginning. The rescue. Detective Harris left soon after our conversation, promising to follow up with more information. Her final question echoed in my mind as I sat in the motel room, alone once again. "Do you have any idea who might have been involved in this besides Robert and Alicia?" I didn't have an answer. I couldn't pinpoint the shadowy figure lurking behind the scenes, pulling the strings, but I knew one thing for sure: there was more to this than I could ever have imagined. Robert and Alicia were not the only ones who had planned my demise. There were others involved, and I needed to find out who they were before it was too late. The investigation had only just begun, and I knew that if I wanted to survive this, I had to act fast. My first step was to get in touch with Evelyn. I needed to speak with her, figure out what she knew, what she suspected. If anyone could help me navigate the storm that was brewing, it was her. I called her immediately. The phone rang a few times before she picked up. "Jenny," Evelyn's voice came through, calm but sharp. "What's going on?" "I need to talk to you," I said quickly. "There's something more to this. I don't know who, but someone else was involved in everything, someone pulling the strings behind Robert and Alicia. I think I'm being watched." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear Evelyn processing my words, weighing the gravity of what I was saying. "Listen to me," she said finally. "I've been looking into this. I've got a lead, but I need you to stay put. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't trust anyone right now." I could hear the concern in her voice, and it made my stomach churn. I'm scared, Evelyn. I don't know who I can trust anymore. You trust me, she replied. That's enough for now. Stay in your room. I'll be there in an hour. We'll figure this out. I ended the call and leaned back in the chair, taking a deep breath. My mind was racing, my thoughts spinning like a whirlwind. How had everything escalated so quickly? Just days ago, I was in a place of shock and disbelief, trying to come to terms with the betrayal of my own son and daughter-in-law. Now I was part of something much bigger, a criminal web that reached far beyond what I had known. I couldn't trust Robert or Alicia, of course, but now I couldn't even trust the authorities. There were others involved, people working in the shadows, and I didn't know who they were. I had been living in the dark, but now the light was beginning to shine on the truth, and it was blinding. An hour later, Evelyn arrived at the motel looking just as sharp and composed as ever. Her blazer was perfectly fitted and her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun. There was no hint of hesitation in her movements. She was a woman on a mission, and I could see it in her eyes. "Where's the folder?" she asked as soon as she stepped inside. I gestured to the desk where the folder sat open, its contents spread out across the surface. The insurance policy, the forged signatures, the emails between Alicia and the insurance agent, it was all there. And now, with Evelyn's help, I knew we could take it to the authorities. The truth was finally within our reach. Evelyn didn't waste any time. She picked up the folder, flipping through the papers with practiced ease, her eyes scanning the details with professional precision. "This is solid evidence," she muttered under her breath. "But it's only the beginning. I need to get in touch with the right people. We'll need to build a case, get everything in order before we make a move." "I don't know how much longer I can wait," I said, my voice tight with anxiety. "I don't feel safe. They're out there, Evelyn. They're watching me." Evelyn's face softened for a moment, and she placed a hand on my shoulder. "You're not alone in this. We're going to make sure they don't get away with it, but you need to stay calm. We have to take this one step at a time." I nodded, but the fear that had been gnawing at me for days wouldn't go away. I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, the constant pressure, the growing dread that something was lurking just out of sight. Over the next few hours, Evelyn worked tirelessly. She made phone calls, spoke to contacts, and coordinated with the authorities, setting things into motion. But she wasn't taking any chances. She insisted on staying with me that night, saying she didn't want me to be alone until we were sure everything was secure. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, but I knew I had to stay focused. The wheels of justice were turning, and I had to trust that they would catch up with Robert and Alicia. But something still nagged at me, the feeling that they weren't working alone, that the person who had tipped them off about the investigation was still out there. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that Evelyn came to a conclusion. She was sitting at the small desk, her eyes narrowed in concentration as she sifted through a series of messages on her phone. "It's him," she said suddenly, her voice low but resolute. "I've been looking into Robert's old associates, and I found someone who might be pulling the strings. It's someone from his past, someone who's been helping him cover his tracks for years." I sat up straighter, my heart pounding. "Who is it?" "His old business partner," Evelyn replied. "A man named Thomas Hargrave. He's been linked to several shady financial dealings. Robert and Alicia were probably in contact with him before they made the plan to kill you. He's the one who would have had the resources to help them with the money laundering and the fake insurance policy." Where is he? I asked, my voice tight with urgency. He's not easy to find, Evelyn said, her brow furrowing. But we have a lead. I'll make sure the authorities get on it. I exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling on me like a rock. Robert and Alicia weren't just part of a local scam, they were entangled in something much bigger, something that stretched beyond what I had ever known. But now we had a name, and that name, Thomas Hargrave, was the key to unraveling everything. As the hours passed, I felt the familiar weight of fear and anxiety pressing on me once more, but this time I didn't feel so helpless. With Evelyn by my side, I knew that I had a chance to bring the people who had tried to kill me to justice. But there was still much work to be done and much danger ahead. The investigation was far from over, but I was ready. I wasn't going to stop until every single person involved in this conspiracy was held accountable. The fight wasn't over, not yet. The investigation intensifies. The hours after Evelyn's revelation about Thomas Hargrave were a mix of uncertainty and growing determination. Hargrave's name was now in my mind, a shadowy figure in the background of this entire operation, and I had no doubt he was the linchpin. If Robert and Alicia were the face of this plot, Hargrave was the mastermind, orchestrating everything from behind the scenes. The more Evelyn revealed, the clearer it became. I had been caught in a far larger web than I could ever have imagined. Evelyn was relentless in her pursuit of the truth. She immediately reached out to her contacts, pulling in every available resource to track down Hargrave and his operations. But finding him wouldn't be easy. Hargrave had always kept a low profile, moving in circles far removed from the ones Robert and Alicia had frequented. But Evelyn wasn't about to let that stop her. She spent the entire night going through financial records, old business transactions, and any other trace that could point her toward his whereabouts. Meanwhile, I sat there in the motel room, trying to hold myself together. The fear was back again, but this time it was different. I wasn't just afraid for my life anymore. I was afraid for the people I had trusted, the lives that could be affected by this investigation. Hargrave wasn't just a local criminal, he had connections, resources. He could make this whole thing disappear if he wanted to, and I had no idea how deep his influence ran. The phone rang the next morning. It was Evelyn. Her voice was low, measured, careful. "I think we found something," she said, her words sending a chill through me. "Hargrave's been involved in something much bigger than we first thought. He's tied to a network of people, drug trafficking, illegal gambling, money laundering on an international scale." I froze, my hand gripping the edge of the table. "What do you mean, international? How does this involve Robert and Alicia?" "They were always small players, Jenny. Hargrave used them because they were easy to manipulate, but now we know they were just part of a much larger network. Hargrave has connections to organized crime in multiple countries. It's not just money they were after, it's control. He's been working with people who can make things disappear. I don't know how far this goes, but we need to be careful. The stakes are much higher than we originally thought." I could hear the concern in her voice, but also the urgency. She wasn't just worried about the legal side of this anymore, she was worried for my safety, and with good reason. Hargrave wasn't just after money. He had power, resources, and a network of people who could cover his tracks. He was connected to people who would stop at nothing to protect him. "We need to get the authorities involved," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This is too big, we can't handle this on our own. I agree, Evelyn replied. I'm working on it, but right now we need to be cautious. Hargrave has people everywhere, Jenny. We need to stay one step ahead. I've got a few more leads I'm following, but I'm going to need you to lay low for a while longer. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I'm not going anywhere, I said, but I need to know that we're doing everything we can. I can't just sit here and wait for them to come after me again. I'm doing everything I can, Evelyn assured me. Just give me a little more time, I promise we'll get to the bottom of this. I hung up the phone, feeling more isolated than ever. The weight of the situation pressed down on me, but there was also a sense of resolve starting to build inside me. I wasn't going to let Hargrave, let alone Robert and Alicia, win. They had underestimated me, but I wasn't the same woman they had thought they could control. I had been through too much already. I wasn't going to back down now. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to keep myself busy, going over every detail of the case, every piece of evidence I had. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something wasn't right. Evelyn had said that Hargrave had a network of people protecting him, but I hadn't seen any indication that they knew where I was. I hadn't received any threats, hadn't seen anyone tailing me, but the fear was still there, lingering in the back of my mind. That night, I decided to take a walk. I needed some air, needed to clear my head. The streets were quiet and I kept to the shadows, avoiding the more populated areas. I didn't want to risk being seen, but as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned a corner and almost collided with a figure in the street. My heart stopped in my chest, and for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing at the edge of the alley. He wore a dark jacket, his face obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice low and almost casual. I took a step back, every instinct screaming at me to run. But instead, I stood there, frozen, trying to read the situation. Was this someone sent by Hargrave, someone watching me? "I'm fine," I said, my voice shaking slightly despite my attempts to sound calm. The man didn't move, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, something that made me feel even more unsettled. "You're not fine," he said slowly. "You're looking for answers and you'll find them, but not here." My heart raced, but I didn't have time to ask what he meant. Before I could react, he stepped back into the shadows and was gone. I stood there for a moment, my mind racing with questions. Who was that man? How did he know what I was doing, and why did he seem so familiar? I turned and hurried back to the motel, my thoughts scattered and confused. Had I just narrowly escaped something, or was this just a coincidence? I didn't know the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. The investigation wasn't just about Robert and Alicia anymore. It was about something far more dangerous, something that I hadn't fully understood yet. As I walked back to my room, I glanced over my shoulder once more, just in case. But there was no sign of the man. The streets were empty and I was alone, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I had to find the answers. And I had to find them before it was too late. The courtroom showdown. The day of the trial arrived sooner than I expected. The events of the past few weeks had unfolded like a dream, or rather, a nightmare. The betrayal, the discovery, the investigation, and now the courtroom, everything had led to this moment. Robert and Alicia were finally going to face the consequences of their actions. But despite the certainty that justice was within reach, I couldn't shake the weight of the impending confrontation. I had always believed that justice was a given, that once the truth was revealed, everything would fall into place. But now, standing in the courtroom, I realized just how fragile that belief was. This wasn't just a trial for Robert and Alicia, it was a trial for me, too. A trial of resilience, of survival, and of the choices I had made. And the outcome wasn't guaranteed. The weight of the past hung heavy over me. Evelyn had been by my side every step of the way, guiding me through the legalities and helping me prepare for the battle ahead. Her unwavering support had been the only thing that kept me grounded. She knew what I was facing, how difficult it would be to stand in front of a room full of strangers and tell my story, but I had to do it, for myself. For my dignity, for justice. The courtroom was packed with people. The air was thick with tension, the weight of what was about to unfold pressing down on everyone. Robert and Alicia sat at the defendant's table, their faces a study in contrasts. Alicia's eyes were downcast, her face pale and drawn. Robert, on the other hand, seemed defiant, his jaw clenched in what I could only describe as a grim determination. He didn't look at me, he didn't need to. The contempt was evident in his posture, in the way he carried himself. I sat in the witness box, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The room was silent except for the occasional murmur from the crowd, the sound of papers rustling, the tapping of pens. The prosecuting attorney stood up, adjusting his tie, his eyes scanning the room before locking onto mine. "Mrs. Collier," he began, his voice steady and respectful. "We've heard from several witnesses, but now we need to hear from you. The truth of what happened, the truth of what was planned comes from you. Please take your time and tell us your story." I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. My hands shook slightly, but I steadied myself. I had prepared for this moment, rehearsed every word in my head, but now that it was here, it felt like everything was happening at once. The anger, the pain, the fear, it all surged to the surface, threatening to overwhelm me. But I couldn't let that happen. I took a deep breath and began to speak. "I'm here today because my son and daughter-in-law tried to kill me," I said, my voice steady despite the weight of the words. "They planned it, they plotted my death. They thought I wouldn't notice, thought I wouldn't understand what was happening, but I did. I heard them talking, I heard them planning, and I knew." The room went silent. I could feel the eyes of everyone on me, their attention focused entirely on my words. I continued, telling the story as clearly as I could, recounting the details of how Robert and Alicia had taken out a life insurance policy in my name, forged my signature, and planned to make my death look like an accident. I described the car, the pills, the ignition timer. I told them about the conversations I had overheard, the way they had manipulated me, all while pretending to be concerned for my well-being. I felt a knot in my chest as I spoke. It was difficult to relive those moments, to put myself back in that place of fear and uncertainty, but I had to do it. I had to show them who Robert and Alicia really were, the people I had trusted, the people I had loved, and how they had turned that love into a weapon. The prosecuting attorney nodded as I finished my statement, his face serious. "Thank you, Mrs. Collier. Your courage is admirable. We'll have the court review the evidence now." The next few hours passed in a blur. The prosecutor laid out the evidence piece by piece. The forged documents, the recordings, the emails, the receipts. Everything we had gathered, everything we had painstakingly compiled was now on the table. It was irrefutable. But I knew that the defense would fight back. They always did. Robert's lawyer, a sharp-looking man with slicked-back hair and a cold, calculating gaze, stood up next, preparing to make his case. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the defense attorney began, his voice smooth and convincing, "what you've heard today is not the whole story. Yes, my clients made some poor decisions. Yes, they acted out of desperation. But they didn't intend for this to go as far as it did. There was no malice, no premeditation. They were simply trying to find a way to keep their family together to ensure a better future. And when things got out of hand, they panicked." His words were carefully crafted, designed to sow doubt in the minds of the jury. He painted Robert and Alicia as victims of circumstance, as people who had made mistakes but were not deserving of such harsh consequences. He played on their emotions, hoping to make them question the evidence, to make them feel sympathy for the accused. But it didn't work. Not on me. I watched as Robert sat there, his expression blank, his eyes fixed on the defense attorney. Alicia, on the other hand, was looking down at the table, her shoulders hunched in defeat. She wasn't even trying to maintain the pretense anymore. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. The defense attorney finished his argument and sat down, and for a moment the room was quiet. The jury was taking everything in, processing what they had heard. The decision would soon be in their hands. I could feel the weight of their gaze, the pressure building in the room. Finally, the judge spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard the evidence. It is now time for you to deliberate." The room fell silent as the jury filed out, leaving only the attorneys, the judge, and me. I looked at Evelyn, who was sitting beside me, her face calm and composed. She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You did well," she said softly. "Now we wait." And so we waited. The minutes stretched into hours, each one heavier than the last. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew that I had done everything I could. The truth had been told, and now it was up to the jury to decide. When the jury finally returned, I felt my heart skip a beat. The foreman stood up, holding the verdict in his hands. "We, the jury, find the defendants, Robert Collier and Alicia Collier, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and attempted manslaughter," he said. I exhaled, a wave of relief washing over me. They had been found guilty. Justice had been served. I looked at Robert and Alicia as they were led away in handcuffs. There was no remorse on their faces, no apology. They were just defeated, but that was enough. They would pay for what they had done. As the courtroom emptied, I stood there, feeling a sense of peace settle over me for the first time in months. The fight was over. The truth had prevailed, and I had survived, moving on. The trial was over. Robert and Alicia were behind bars, convicted of their crimes. The gavel had come down and the verdict had been delivered. But as I sat in the aftermath of it all, I realized that the true challenge wasn't the trial itself. It wasn't the courtroom, the evidence, or even the brutal truths that had been exposed. No, the real challenge was what came after. What did it mean to survive something like this? How did you pick up the pieces and move forward when the ground beneath your feet had been pulled out from under you? I left the courthouse with Evelyn by my side, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The weight that had settled on my shoulders for so long was gone, replaced by something lighter, something that had been hard to define until now: freedom. The freedom that comes from knowing you have survived, that you have faced down your darkest fears and come out the other side stronger, more resilient. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. I had spent so much of my life wrapped up in the web that Robert and Alicia had spun around me, and now I had to learn to live without them. I had to figure out what came next, how to rebuild a life that had been shattered by betrayal. It felt like starting over from scratch, but this time I knew I had the strength to do it. In the weeks that followed the trial, I kept a low profile. The media coverage was intense at first. Everywhere I went, I was confronted by the story, by people who wanted to ask questions or offer their opinions. I didn't blame them. The story was dramatic, shocking, and deeply emotional. But I wasn't interested in being a symbol of someone else's narrative. I didn't want to be defined by the betrayal I had endured. I wanted to reclaim my life on my terms. I spent a lot of time reflecting. The quiet of my small apartment gave me the space to think, to process, and to heal. I spent my mornings with a cup of tea, watching the world go by through the window, and my afternoons reading, writing in a journal, or even taking short walks around the neighborhood. I had lived so much of my life for other people, catering to their needs, fulfilling their expectations. Now it was my turn to do what I wanted. Evelyn checked in on me regularly, always offering advice and encouragement. She was the one person who truly understood what I had been through. I had always known she was a good friend, but after everything we had been through together, she became more than that. She was my ally, my rock, the person who had helped me navigate the darkness and find my way back to the light. One afternoon, about a month after the trial, Evelyn invited me to lunch. We met at a small cafe, one of her favorite spots. As we sat down, she slid an envelope across the table to me. "What's this?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. Evelyn smiled. "Open it." Inside the envelope was a check, a large one. I blinked, not quite understanding what I was seeing. "I thought you should have it," Evelyn said. "It's your share of the insurance payout." I stared at the check for a moment, then looked back up at her, confused. But the insurance was never meant for me. It was a fraudulent policy. Robert and Alicia were the beneficiaries. Evelyn nodded. "Yes, but with their conviction, the court deemed the policy invalid. The funds have been redistributed and you're entitled to your portion. It's not much, but it's yours." I didn't know how to react. The money was unexpected and part of me felt uncomfortable accepting it. After everything that had happened, it felt like a strange form of compensation. But Evelyn was right. I had been wronged. This wasn't about guilt or shame. It was about reclaiming what was mine, what was owed to me after everything I had endured. "Thank you," I said quietly, taking the check. I couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was standing on my own 2 feet, reclaiming what was rightfully mine and starting to build a life that was free from fear, from manipulation, from deceit. Over the next few months, I used the money to make some changes. I moved into a new apartment, one that felt like a fresh start. It was small, modest, but it was mine. I painted the walls a soft shade of blue, filled the space with plants and books, and created a space where I could breathe, where I could truly be myself. I hadn't realized how much I had lost of myself in the years I had spent trying to please others, trying to make things work with people who didn't care about me. I also started volunteering at a local community center. It felt like the right thing to do. I had always believed in giving back, but for so long I had been too caught up in my own struggles to truly engage with others. Now I had the time, the energy, and the desire to help. It was a way to regain my sense of purpose, to remind myself that there was more to life than surviving. There was living, and I was ready to live again. The world didn't stop, of course. Life went on as it always does, but I was no longer afraid of it. I was no longer afraid of the people who had tried to destroy me. I had faced them, I had won, and I had come out the other side stronger. I knew that there would still be challenges ahead, that there would always be dark days, but I also knew that I could handle them. I had learned the most important lesson of all. That my strength didn't come from anyone else's approval or love. It came from within. Evelyn and I remained close, of course. She had been my lifeline throughout it all, and our bond had only deepened since the trial. We took trips together, went to dinner, and simply enjoyed each other's company. She had helped me reclaim my life, and for that I would always be grateful. But even as I moved forward, I never forgot what had happened. I couldn't. The betrayal, the lies, the near-death experience, it had all changed me. But it had also given me a deeper understanding of who I was. I had survived, and now I was thriving. As I stood in front of my new apartment looking out at the city skyline, I smiled. I had made it. The past was behind me, and the future, my future, was bright. The lesson was clear. No matter how dark things got, no matter how lost you feel there. And for the first time in a long time, I truly believed it. The key message in this story is the importance of resilience, self-awareness, and the power of reclaiming one's life after betrayal or hardship. It shows that no matter how deeply you are wronged, you have the strength to survive and rebuild. Life is full of challenges, but true strength comes from within, knowing who you are, trusting your instincts, and having the courage to face difficult situations head-on. Even in the face of manipulation and betrayal, it's possible to find a way to take back control, whether it's through justice, self-reflection, or building meaningful relationships with those who truly care about you. For those in their later years, this story is a reminder that age is not a barrier to transformation. You are never too old to reclaim your life, set boundaries, or pursue new goals. Every chapter of life holds the potential for growth, healing, and new beginnings. No matter the trials you face, remember that resilience, determination, and the courage to stand up for yourself can lead to a brighter, more fulfilling future. What would you have done if you were in her shoes? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to check out our next video where we'll explore more incredible tales of survival and strength. Thanks for watching, and remember, your story matters too.